What if I told you that being locked in a basement for 3 years was the best thing that ever happened to me? I know it sounds insane, but stick with me because this story is about to blow your mind. My own family thought they could hide me away, control my life, and keep me from my inheritance. But guess what? Their plan backfired so spectacularly that I ended up owning not just the house they locked me in, but their entire empire. This is the story of how I went from basement prisoner to property owner, and trust me, revenge has never tasted so sweet. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how manipulation, family secrets, and one perfectly executed legal strategy turn the tables completely. So grab your popcorn, because this roller coaster is just getting started. Let me paint you a picture of where this nightmare began. My name doesn't matter, but what matters is that I was 22 years old when my world completely imploded. My grandmother, the matriarch of our wealthy family, had just passed away, and everyone was buzzing about her will. See, my grandmother owned multiple properties, had investments worth millions, and everyone knew she was going to leave everything to someone in the family. The tension was thick, and family dinners became these weird strategic meetings where everyone was trying to figure out who would inherit what. Here's where it gets twisted. My stepmother, Linda, had married my father 5 years earlier, and she had been playing the long game perfectly. She was sweet, caring, always bringing my grandmother homemade cookies and spending hours listening to her stories. Everyone thought she was this angel, but I saw through her act. I noticed how she would redirect conversations about the will, how she would subtly plant seeds about other family members being irresponsible with money. She was masterfully manipulating an elderly woman, and it made my stomach turn. The day everything changed was a Tuesday. I remember because I had just gotten back from my part-time job at the local bookstore. My father called me into his study with this serious expression I had never seen before. Linda was there too, sitting in the corner with this fake concerned look on her face. My father told me that my grandmother's will had been read, and there was a problem. Apparently, she had left me the main family house and a substantial portion of her assets. But there was a catch. The inheritance came with conditions that required me to prove my responsibility and maturity. Now, this should have been amazing news, right? Wrong. My father explained that the family had decided I wasn't ready for such responsibility. They had convinced themselves that I was too young, too impulsive, and too naive to handle such wealth. Linda nodded along, adding comments about how money changes people and how they had seen it happen to other families. They painted this picture of me potentially becoming corrupted by wealth, losing my values, and destroying the family legacy. The solution they proposed was absolutely insane. They wanted me to spend some time in a controlled environment where I could mature and really think about the responsibility that came with the inheritance. When they said controlled environment, I thought they meant maybe a financial planning course or working with a mentor. I never imagined they meant literally locking me in the basement of the very house I had just inherited. They framed it as a temporary arrangement, maybe a few months, where I could reflect on what it meant to be wealthy and responsible. The basement wasn't just some storage space either. They had converted it into what they called a studio apartment. There was a bed, a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and even a desk area. Linda had decorated it with motivational posters and self-help books. They made it sound like some kind of luxury retreat for personal growth. My father handed me a schedule of daily activities, meditation times, and reflection exercises. They said I would have access to educational materials and that they would visit regularly to check on my progress. Looking back, I can't believe I fell for it initially. They made it sound so reasonable, so caring. They convinced me that this was what people with real wealth did. They prepared themselves mentally and spiritually before taking on such responsibility. Linda even showed me articles about wealthy families who had similar traditions of preparing their heirs. She had done her research and had all these examples of successful people who had spent time in isolation before taking on their inheritance. The first week wasn't terrible. I actually bought into the whole personal growth narrative. I read the books they provided, did the meditation exercises, and wrote in the journal they had given me. My father visited every few days, and we had these deep conversations about responsibility and family legacy. Linda would bring down home-cooked meals and would ask about my progress with genuine interest. I started thinking maybe this crazy arrangement was actually going to work. But then the visits became less frequent. The conversations became shorter and more superficial. When I asked about timelines for when this preparation period would end, I got vague answers about needing more time and not rushing the process. The books stopped being replaced when I finished them. The home-cooked meals turned into simple sandwiches and microwave dinners. Slowly but surely, the comfortable retreat atmosphere was turning into something that felt much more like imprisonment. By the end of the first month, the reality of my situation was becoming clear. This wasn't about preparing me for wealth. This was about keeping me away from it. I could hear them upstairs, moving around freely in the house that was legally mine, making decisions about property that I should have been controlling. When I tried to bring this up during one of my father's increasingly rare visits, he dismissed my concerns and told me I was proving exactly why I wasn't ready for such responsibility. The gaslighting was masterful, and I was starting to doubt my own perception of what was happening. Month 2 was when everything clicked into place, and let me tell you, the rage I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I found out the truth completely by accident, and it changed everything. Linda had been bringing down my meals, and one day she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she used the bathroom. A text message popped up that made my blood run cold. It was from a real estate agent, thanking her for the listing and confirming the showing for the next afternoon. My house, the house I was locked under, was being sold. I pretended to still be reading when Linda came back, but inside I was screaming. Everything made sense now. They weren't preparing me for anything. They were stealing from me. While I was playing their game of personal growth and responsibility, they were actively working to sell off my inheritance and pocket the money. The beautiful irony was that they needed me out of the way to do it, and they had convinced me to voluntarily remove myself from the equation. I had to give them credit. It was a brilliantly evil plan. That night, I started planning my escape and my revenge. But here's the thing about spending weeks in isolation, reading self-help books, and business strategy guides. You start thinking very strategically. Instead of just breaking out and confronting them, which would have been my first instinct, I decided to play the long game just like Linda had been doing. I was going to beat them at their own game, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single day they had stolen from me. First, I needed to document everything. I started keeping detailed records of my imprisonment, dates, times of visits, conversations, everything. I used my phone to record our interactions when possible. I photographed the basement setup, the schedule they had given me, and anything else that could serve as evidence later. I also started researching property law, inheritance law, and anything related to fraud and false imprisonment. The basement had Wi-Fi, and they had given me access to educational materials, so I had everything I needed to build my case. The legal research was eye-opening. What they were doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal on multiple levels. False imprisonment, inheritance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and potentially a dozen other charges. But more importantly, I discovered that any contracts or sales made without the legal owner's knowledge or consent were completely invalid. Even if they managed to sell the house while I was locked in the basement, I could have those sales reversed and potentially claim additional damages. While I was building my legal case, I was also working on my physical escape plan. The basement had one window that was supposed to be painted shut, but I discovered that the paint was actually just covering loose screws. Over the course of several weeks, I carefully worked those screws loose using a butter knife from the kitchenette. I made sure the window still looked secure from the outside, but I could now remove it completely when I was ready to leave. The psychological game I played during this period was probably the hardest part. I had to continue pretending that I believed in their personal growth narrative while secretly preparing to destroy them. When my father visited, I thanked him for giving me this opportunity to mature. When Linda brought down meals, I shared insights from the self-help books and talked about how much I was learning about responsibility. I even asked them to extend my time in the basement because I felt like I was making such great progress. Month 3 was when I put my plan into action. I had been monitoring their activities through social media and public records, and I knew exactly when they would both be out of the house for an extended period. They were attending a family wedding in another state, and they would be gone for 4 days. This was my window to execute the most important phase of my plan. I wasn't just escaping, I was taking back everything they had tried to steal. The night before they left for the wedding, I had my most Oscar-worthy performance. I thanked them both for everything they were doing for me. I told them how much I had grown and how grateful I was for their wisdom in knowing I wasn't ready for the responsibility of wealth. I even gave Linda a hug and told her she was like a real mother to me. The irony was almost too much to bear, but I needed them to leave town completely confident that their plan was working perfectly. As soon as their car pulled out of the driveway that Thursday morning, I put my plan into motion. I removed the basement window, climbed out into the backyard, and walked around to the front door of my own house using the spare key I knew was hidden under a fake rock. Standing in that house as a free person, knowing that it was legally mine and that I was about to take back control of my life, was one of the most empowering moments I had ever experienced. But the work was just beginning, and I had 4 days to change everything. Walking through that house for the first time in 3 months felt surreal, but I didn't have time to savor the moment. I had 4 days to execute the most important part of my plan, and every minute counted. My first stop was my father's study, where I knew he kept all the important paperwork. What I found there was even worse than I had imagined. They hadn't just been planning to sell my house, they had been systematically looting my entire inheritance. The evidence was right there in black and white. Forged documents with my signature, fake power of attorney papers, and contracts for multiple property sales. They had been busy little criminals, and they had documented everything because they thought I would never see it. Linda had even kept a notebook detailing their strategy, including timelines for different property sales and how they planned to distribute the money. Reading through their plans felt like discovering a detailed confession written by the criminals themselves. I photographed everything, but I also did something they never expected. I started reversing their fraudulent actions. Using my legal inheritance documents and proper identification, I contacted every real estate agent, lawyer, and financial institution they had been working with. One by one, I canceled their fraudulent contracts and sales agreements. The house sale that Linda had been texting about? Canceled, with the buyers informed that the seller had no legal authority to sell the property. But canceling their schemes wasn't enough. I wanted them to face real consequences for what they had done to me. I spent the next 2 days working with a lawyer who specialized in inheritance fraud and family law. We prepared criminal charges against both of them, including false imprisonment, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. We also prepared civil cases that would ensure I could claim damages for the emotional distress and financial losses they had caused. The lawyer was amazed by how well I had documented everything during my imprisonment. The recordings, photographs, and detailed timeline I had kept were exactly what we needed to build an airtight case. He told me that most people in my situation would have just escaped and tried to move on with their lives. But by playing the long game and gathering evidence, I had given myself the power to not just recover my inheritance, but to make them pay for their crimes. While I was working with the lawyer, I was also taking practical control of all my assets. I changed all the locks on the house, canceled any credit cards or accounts they had access to, and made sure they couldn't continue their fraudulent activities, even if they wanted to. I also discovered assets I didn't even know I had inherited. My grandmother had been even wealthier than I realized, and she had left me properties and investments that Linda and my father hadn't even found yet. The most satisfying part was setting up their welcome home surprise. I arranged for the police to be waiting when they returned from the wedding, armed with all the evidence of their crimes and ready to make arrests. But I also wanted them to understand exactly how completely their plan had backfired. I left a note on the kitchen table that simply said, "Thanks for the personal growth opportunity." I learned so much about responsibility and family loyalty. Your former basement prisoner and current homeowner. When they returned from the wedding that Sunday evening, their world imploded in the most beautiful way possible. The police were waiting in their driveway with warrants for their arrest. The locks had been changed, so they couldn't even get into the house. And when they tried to call the real estate agents and lawyers they had been working with, they discovered that all their fraudulent deals had been canceled and reported to the authorities. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. With all the evidence I had gathered, they couldn't deny what they had done. My father was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy, while Linda got 5 years because she had been the primary architect of the scheme. They were also ordered to pay substantial damages for the emotional distress and financial losses they had caused me. But here's the most poetic part of this whole story. They had to pay those damages by selling their own assets, including Linda's previous home and my father's car collection. The money they had tried to steal from me ended up making me even wealthier than my original inheritance. Their greed had backfired so completely that they ended up funding their own victims' success. I went from being a prisoner in my own basement to owning not just my grandmother's properties, but theirs as well. Looking back on this experience, I realized that those 3 months in the basement were actually a gift, even though they were meant to be a prison. I learned patience, strategy, and the power of playing the long game. I discovered legal and business skills I never knew I had. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate retaliation. It's careful planning followed by complete and total victory. They thought they were hiding me away to steal my future, but instead, they gave me the time and motivation to build a better one than I ever could have imagined.